And we're recording now. Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to this Q&A session with Derek Minno-Bloom on food and housing justice issues. My name is Brendan Hunter. I'm a program director for leadership resources at the Episcopal Church Foundation. So glad that you're taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us this afternoon to discuss this very important topic. Thanks everyone to for introducing yourselves. If you haven't already, actually you've got the chat box open. We got a smaller group, which is great, and a couple of folks joining us on Facebook Live as well. But do take advantage of this, the chat box and the comments on the Facebook page throughout this afternoon's Q&A session. I can relay questions from Facebook to Derek. Really quickly, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Episcopal Church Foundation, ECF was founded in 1949 and is an independent lay-led organization. Our mission is to strengthen the strategic leadership and financial capabilities of Episcopal congregations, dioceses, and other organizations such as camps and conference centers, and other charities and religious orders, anything Episcopal, really. We do this through a variety of programs, including capital campaigns, plan giving, endowment management, strategic solutions. We publish the vestry resource guide as well as vital practices, which includes vestry papers. Check out our website, episcopalfoundation.org, if you haven't already, to see the variety of programs and services that we offer. So I think I've spoken plenty enough already, and I'll hand it over to Derek, who will introduce himself.
Well, thanks, Brendan. And thanks to ECF for having me and for accepting me as a fellowship. Can never thank you all enough. And I want to say hi to Eve and Alba. Little Silver, New Jersey, so close. And then also Santa Fe, which I lived in Albuquerque for a while. So glad to have you. And whoever else is here watching, good to have you as well. But yeah, so I am the Social and Food Justice Director at Trinity Episcopal Church in Asbury Park. And we have a three-pronged program that we like to talk about, and we like to call it an intersectional program. So sort of similar, I think people are familiar with Martin Luther King when he said, a threat to justice anywhere is an injustice anywhere, something similar to that effect. So that any injustice affects everyone, so that we have to have a multi-pronged system. So during this talk, I will talk about, food justice has to do with racial justice and economic justice and sexuality and gender justice, so like that. But our three prongs are, one, we want to ask why people are hungry. And the answers we've come up with for that are unjust economic systems, systemic racism. And one thing that we do, which makes us pretty special as a soup kitchen, every Saturday when people come, we get everything ready, we cook the food, and right before we serve, we have a little talk about why people are hungry in the wealthiest country in the world. And we give them those answers: systemic racism, unjust economic systems. But specifically, we ask that why people are hungry in the United States, because we probably have the most money out of any country, or the GDP of any country. Maybe there's the top 2 or 3 anyway. And we have over 43 million people that experience hunger insecurity. So that means they don't know where their next meal is coming from. And then also we have 750,000 people that are on the streets at any given time in our country. So as far as first world countries go, we're at the top of the list for having the most hungry people and the most folks living on the streets. So we ask people why that is. And so we do a training, and people leave kind of having some ideas, more systemic ideas of why people are hungry, which hopefully we'll get to in this talk. So that was the first point: ask why people are hungry. The second point is to meet the immediate needs of hunger in our community, until we live in a community or country that sees food as a human right. And we do that by our food pantry, which is open 3 days a week, and our soup kitchen, which is open 1 day a week. And we figure we feed about 300 to 500 people a week and about 35,000 meals a year. So that's how we meet the immediate need of hunger until we organize where there is nobody hungry. And then the third part is that we want to organize within the community to prevent future hunger and injustice, so that we don't just do one part. So some of the things we do with organizing is we realize that racism is a part of hunger. Sorry, there's someone talking behind me. I'm getting a little distracted. So we do various things to organize within the community to end future hunger. And one of those things we realize is that racism is a part of it. So we do many educational events around racism. So if you've got to read some of the updates that the ECF does of the work I've been doing, we see that educating people on how racism works will also help people understand why people are hungry, and eventually will kind of lead to the end of racism, will lead to the end of hunger. And so, you know, we realize that this is a long-term vision, but we believe that we have to do all these things at the same time. So we do that, and we also have written an affordable housing ordinance, kind of understanding that people are hungry in Asbury Park because housing is so expensive. And as things go, or the word people like to use, as gentrification comes in, housing's more expensive, and people who have lived there their whole lives who are low income are now being pushed out. So one of the reasons we do affordable housing is we hope that if there's more affordable housing, people are able to pay their housing and buy food versus using their whole paycheck to pay their rent and then not be able to get food. And then another thing we talk about and organize in the community is LGBTQ rights, which a lot of people are like, huh, like how does that have to do with food justice? But we understand that I think out of 40% of youth that are on the streets identify as LGBTQ, and they understand what happens is in the ages of 15, 16, or 17, they come out to their parents or their family or their guardians, and then they're asked to leave their house, so that now they don't have a home, and since they don't have a home or a job, they're also hungry. So to end homophobia or transphobia is also to fight against hunger. So we do that within the community through various different ways as well. And the last thing I'll speak about before questions is a really exciting part we do, but we believe when we organize in the community, that those that are most affected by an injustice should be the main people fighting that injustice. So one thing we did is about a year ago, we had, just one second. Hey, Kurt, can you take it outside? One thing we did a few years ago is we had an event where we had 8 people who are experiencing homelessness were the main speakers of the event, with the belief that people need to hear from the people most affected more than the professor or a social worker like myself. So we had about 100 people come to this event, and we had 8 speakers, and 8 speakers were really powerful. So powerful, as a matter of fact, 3 of those speakers were taken home that night and found housing immediately, which we can talk about a little bit of how we can look outside of the state, and as a church, we can house people. But that event was so powerful that I said, you know, we need to organize. Everything you are doing is so amazing. And so that group of 8 people that spoke who are experiencing homelessness got together about a week or 2 later, and I asked, what is the biggest need in Asbury Park? And almost 2 or 3 of them said that there's no housing for women experiencing homelessness, specifically single women. There's housing for family and things like this. And so we had this idea of, well, why don't we go to different churches to see if we can house women each night? So long story short, for about 10 months, this original crew who spoke, myself and some other people, went to different churches and organized the Women's Hospitality Network, which is a women that looks to house single women experiencing homelessness. And December 1st was our first night open, and we've been housing women ever since. And again, so we look at this housing as, now that these women are housed, they can spend more of their money towards food or save up so that they can afford rent. And we also provide food for them each night they stay. So again, we have a 3-pronged system. We ask why people are hungry. We meet the immediate needs of hunger, and then we organize in the community to fight future hunger and injustice.
Great, thanks, Derek. We'll open up everything to your questions. If you're participating on Zoom, if you can type into the chat box any questions or comments that you have. If you're joining us through Facebook Live, you can comment in the comment section below the video and the post in description to Derek, and I will relay those over to him. And while people are typing, Derek, I would just love to hear a little bit about you, or a little about your thoughts in terms of how congregations typically are in a position of having, say, like a soup kitchen that they do once a week or once a month, or a food pantry collection that they're doing, and the feeling of, well, how does one adjust the systemic problems and really try to get to systemic change when we're kind of in this pattern of doing, you know, this thing on a weekly or monthly basis, but kind of feel like, well, how does one go beyond that to really address some of those really major parts of the issues?
Very good question. And the one thing I do say when kind of asked that, because we'll talk about small reasons people are hungry, and then, yeah, racism is a pretty huge thing to start talking about. But one thing I do want to say is it's very important that those soup kitchens and pantries are there. The first act is kind of understanding that that pantry or soup kitchen itself is an act of justice. It's realizing that people are hungry and you're taking that need and meeting it. So that in itself is an act of justice. So just to, I think sometimes people are like, oh, we just have a soup kitchen or a pantry, it's not a big deal. But because at the moment this country isn't able to provide food, you're providing it. So that in itself is a huge act of justice. So to anybody that's doing that, I think that's a great thing. And the second part, how do we start addressing more systemic things on a very simple level? I think the first part is through relationship. Building relationships in your community is key. I think when I was in Asbury, kind of almost didn't do anything for the first year-ish as far as large-scale organizing, just trying to build relationships with people. So wherever you are, you would ask the people coming to your pantry, hey, what are your needs? What's going on? To kind of get an idea of what's going on. And then also get connected to the other congregations that have pantries or soup kitchens and ask them what's going on. And, you know, kind of just get a lot of questions and hear what's going on. Because one thing I think churches sometimes do is they decide what's needed and then go for and do it. But in our model, we want to hear, especially if we're new to a town or like myself, we want to hear what the community wants before we kind of tell the community what is needed. One of our models is more solidarity rather than charity. So a big phrase that's kind of brought up now is joint struggle. And I think Red Cloud talked about it, who was an Indigenous elder from Minneapolis, if I'm correct, or what is now known as Minneapolis. But he said, if you're here for charity or because you feel bad for me, this is paraphrasing, I don't want you. But if you're here because you see that our oppressions and our justice are intertwined, come walk with me. So we take that model to build relationship with people in the community to see what's needed first, and then kind of start moving forward systemically. So for example, in Asbury Park, when I got here, I was asking those questions, reading books about the history, her story of Asbury Park. And I found that there's a train track splitting the city, that it's a class divide and an ethnic divide, and that 150 years ago, the town was split up that way. It was founded that way to have sort of tourism on one side by the beach and working class, and it was working class Italians and working class African Americans, and they could only work on the other side of the tracks by the beach. They weren't allowed to go to the beach, they weren't allowed to eat. And specifically in Asbury, folks from the African diaspora or Black folks weren't allowed to the beach till the late 60s. So anyway, learning about these histories and how, you know, racism is still a part of it, specifically that the hungriest population in Asbury is connected to people from the African diaspora. So yeah, really start asking questions, building relationships, don't go too fast, because I think some people get really excited and they try to do big things, but start small, hear what's needed from the community, and then move forward from them. And you're doing small events first, and then they get bigger as you gain more team members and community input.
Great, thanks, Derek. Again, invite folks on Zoom or Facebook to put in your questions or comments. If you're on Zoom and would like to speak to Derek, I can also move you up to a panelist, and we can also be able to tune in, and if you'd like to speak that rather than type that out onto the screen. And Alba's just shared with us that I like the idea of the homeless and hungry actively fighting for justice. Not sure Santa Fe is doing that. We do have shelters for women and children, and for men in Santa Fe, we have weekly food pantry distribution as well. We're impacted by drug addictions as well.
Oh, well, thanks for bringing that up. And so I lived in Albuquerque for 3 years, so spent a decent amount of time in Santa Fe as well. And so if you don't think, shelters and people are doing it, I think one exciting part, and I think when I sometimes do these justice talks at a soup kitchen, when I'm talking about, specifically since we're talking about New Mexico, we'll talk about settler colonialism, or what European and Spanish ancestors had done to the indigenous people of that land, which in Santa Fe, it's Pueblo and Dineh or Navajo. I always start there and say, who was the first hungry population in the country? And people are like, whoa, we're going back 500 years in this talk. But when you think about it, the indigenous folks had healthy food systems. They knew how to do horticulture and garden. And then people came and took away their lifeways and traditions and land. And sometimes there's younger folks at these talks. So I say, well, there was no grocery stores. So what happened if you didn't have land? What didn't you have access to? And it would be food. So I like to start all the way back there. So specifically going in Santa Fe, where there still are lots of indigenous people, and what you'll notice in Santa Fe, from what I know, there's a large indigenous population experiencing homelessness, as well as low-income white population. And one thing I'll say, you'll notice I keep saying experiencing homelessness. You're like, oh, that's a mouthful. And yes, it is. But I think it's important to say that and recognize that that's something they're experiencing. That's not who they are. They're not someone who doesn't have a home. They're Joe or Billy or Robert or Sally, who has a family. They have loved ones. They've cried. They take joy. Get to know people's name and understand that, people are experiencing this, not necessarily they're not a homeless person. Similar to the phrase, I think we know not to call people bums, but homeless is almost kind of the same thing, saying, hey, you are homeless, you're nothing more than that, other than, people living on the streets are just as beautiful and powerful as people living inside. So looking at, you're not seeing that they're actively doing that, working for justice in the soup kitchens or shelters. I think that happens a lot. I think, and not to critique shelters or food pantries, but there's so much. So, I mentioned colonialism and what our ancestors did. And, when we look at the population in New Mexico, indigenous folks were made hungry and still remain the hungriest population in New Mexico and throughout the country. And then African folks from the African diaspora is the second hungriest population. So the great injustice of settler colonialism, slavery, still has effects today. And so I think one of the first things to do, what you would do in Santa Fe, would be to start having those conversations. Hey, pantries, soup kitchens, you get people together. Why are people hungry? And, people have different answers, and hopefully you'll have a set of answers before you call the meeting, but you'll kind of start working towards something else. So in Santa Fe, it might be the low minimum wage. If the minimum wage was higher, people would be able to afford rent easier. So you could do a $15 minimum wage campaign or whatever people do there. But, I think connecting justice to why people are there, that hunger is not, or homelessness is not just this magical cause, that it's actually people cause it because it's not important to them. For instance, 40% of the food in the United States is thrown out in our country. So how do we reclaim that food and get it back to families? And I think pantries and places do that. But not to go on too long, I think you just start identifying who the shelters are, who the pantries are, and you start talking about why people are hungry. And I think people will always go towards an injustice. And then you might pick multiple forms of injustice, or you might pick one, and then together you start working on that issue. And I find you start getting to know other community leaders that are already working on those issues. And one thing we really stress is to not reinvent the wheel, to meet community issues that are already leaders that are already working on those issues, and see how you can support that, especially if they're a person most affected by something. So definitely in Santa Fe, I certainly recommend getting in touch with Indigenous elders and, asking them how you could support their struggle and things like that.
It's terrific. Thank you, Derek. Question for you. When it comes to this work, it can be tremendously rewarding, but also tremendously draining. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about spirituality and spiritual practices that you have found, or others that have practiced, that you find help strengthen and rejuvenate yourself in this sort of work that you're doing.
Yeah. Well, I think, it's good for any spiritual person to not assume we've arrived. I'm still learning. I'm still learning new practices of how to deal with that. To give you an honest answer, sometimes I deal with that really well. And, meditation is really great, and prayer is really good. Community, family, friends. I like to surf to kind of get my head out of, where I am, especially in the winter. The water's cold. It really grounds you in that one place. But yeah, sometimes I think the truth is, doing this work and being this connected, there is going to be grief and sadness. And I think sometimes our culture runs away from grief and sadness. And I think that's why you'll find people aren't talking necessarily about unjust economic systems. For example, 8 people in the world today control just as much money as half the world's population. So 8 people have just as much money as 3.5 billion people. That's depressing. It's sad. And, whether people believe in communism or capitalism, I think we can say whatever economic system we've had has failed if 8 people control just as much as 3.5 billion people. The money isn't trickling down. We're not sharing it. That's depressing. Truth of the matter that today in Africa, 10,000 children will starve to death. That's really debilitating, But what I think is really important is to not pretend that that's not happening, and is to engage with those things, to realize that my friends that I've made in the pantry and the soup kitchen are still out on the street, are still cold, have addictions, which I believe addiction should be seen as a health crisis, not a criminal crisis. And that's another whole topic. But I think the first thing in doing this work and it being hard is to kind of look grief in the face and say, grief is okay. Grief is okay because it means you're mourning something. If you have grief for something lost, it means you love that. So part of grief and sadness is love. But I think you need to balance that grief out. Hey, Kirk, River's up. And by balancing that, there's a joy part. Everyone too, I just have my little one who's sick today, so my friend's watching them. So if you hear Papa, that's where that's coming from. But that's a good to talk about River. you do need joy when doing this work. So I do have a 2.5-year-old who brings me great joy, and happiness and laughter, and also tiredness. But yeah, finding that joy and that balance. And I think, if I'm going to be honest, when I started the ECF, talking to you all about what are some of the things that are hard, I think I said, I'm a little stressed out. Joy is a little hard. And I realized that you have to actively, I think Henry Nouwen said, you have to actively choose joy every day, even though you've considered the facts. So every day I try to, we're going to go upstairs, everybody. Every day we try to focus on joy, and it can be hard, but I think when we continue to try and focus on something, it becomes more real. So if I was to be honest, I think some days I'm 50% joy and 50% sadness, and some days it changes, but I think it's a constant struggle to be doing good work in the world. But if you're doing that in relationship, there's also going to be pain. So to try to balance it is sometimes all you can do. But yeah.
Thank you, Derek. That's very well put. And as we are getting closer to closing out again, we'll just invite any comments or questions from those participating on Zoom or on our Facebook live stream as well. Derek, as we're beginning, Eve says she has a question about how to lead a congregation into a new understanding of helping. Her congregation is very happy to raise money for a cause, but she would like to guide them towards more.
That's great. Thanks, Eve. And I would love to meet you. Little Silver is so close. So if you ever want to come and stop by, I'll type my email here. That way you can have it if you want to come by. And I think that's a really good and important question. Well, one, too, I think when we're talking about money and fundraising, that is an exciting thing. And one thing we can do as churches is sometimes we do like to support pantries and soup kitchens and things like that. But I think it's also fun to look at who are most affected in certain situations and support them financially. So for instance, in North Jersey, there's the Ramapo Lenape that are, they have an encampment that is against a pipeline in North Jersey, and they want to continually stay on their ancestral homelands and pray. But for congregations to look at that and support that prayer camp, or looking at things like Black Lives Matter, or which we have a local chapter in Asbury Park that can always use support, is a good way to funnel resources to people that are on the front lines fighting for hunger or racial justice. But as far as getting your congregation to move more than just to be fundraisers, and as a fundraiser, I would, if my job was only fundraising, I probably wouldn't do my job. So I think it is important to get out there and do the work. So on a very basic level, I invite your church to come volunteer at our soup kitchen. We take churches up to 6 to 8 people every Saturday, and you can kind of get a feel for that. I think sometimes people aren't going to step right, like, let's start this whole program and get into action. So maybe coming to our soup kitchen can be kind of a first step. You get a few people who are motivated to come out and kind of see what that's like, and maybe they'll come again, or you all can be regulars. We encourage people to cook the meals for us, and that way we can serve the meal that your church cooks. We serve about 200 to 230 people every Saturday. So that's a really easy way to get involved. And I do recommend, I think when we start learning about justice, we really just want to hop in there, start slow. So maybe volunteer at a soup kitchen with your whole church as a community, maybe come once or twice, and then start doing that work to, hey, and Little Silver, what are the issues? Ask other community leaders, what are the issues? And maybe those people that have been coming to the soup kitchen would be excited to get involved in a local issue. But yeah, never get discouraged. At Trinity, we have the Racial Justice Project, and it just started out with 2 or 3 of us, and now there's multiple members, and we do almost every event we have has 80 to 150 people coming. But our first events were 6 and 8 people, kind of for a while. So we keep plugging along, and I think you'll see people showing up. But I would love to talk to you outside of this, so feel free to email me, and we can kind of troubleshoot together. But I think one thing I like to focus on with churches is that when we fight for racial justice or economic justice or food justice or LGBTQ rights, that the reason we do it is because the love that God has given us. That if we're truly to love our neighbor, we're going to stand up for all our neighbors and fight justice alongside of them. So that it's really an act guided by love. I'd love to come speak to your church as well. Yeah, there's so many things we could do, but that's just a short answer.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Derek, for your thoughts and providing this for all of us. We've reached the end of our time together, but again, we welcome other questions and comments as well. Also want to just put out a note for those who registered for this online Q&A. If you will take just a quick moment to go to your inbox, there's going to be a link to a survey. Just take a couple of minutes, provide your feedback. This is helpful for us in planning our future online Q&As and webinar opportunities. So want to thank everybody for coming out this afternoon and wish everybody the best in all of their ministry and work.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your time and presence.